All right, guys, welcome back to episode number 9 with Evolution Athletics. My name is Travis Barrett, and today I'm sitting down with Dr. Christopher Tabor at Sacred Heart University, and his research primarily focuses on eccentric training and among other things, but I will let him go ahead and introduce himself, and we'll get into it.
So a little bit about my background. I graduated from Penn State University with my undergrad in kinesiology, and then continued on, graduated from East Tennessee State with my PhD in sport physiology and performance. And while I was there, I was lucky enough to work as a weightlifting coach, assistant weightlifting coach at the Olympic training site. And after I completed my studies there, I traveled up here and took my first job at Sacred Heart. I've been here ever since. So I teach strength conditioning for both the undergrads and graduates here to prepare them to go out into the field. And then I coach weightlifting part-time. So I'm the head coach of 2 weightlifting teams here in Connecticut, the Sacred Heart weightlifting team, and then another weightlifting team in my town of Branford, Connecticut. So that's how I keep my coaching edge sharp.
Yep.
And then the rest of my time is spent in the lab performing research. So I have a ever-growing research team, and really we will tackle any problem that they can come up with. But my current research is focused on accentuated eccentric loading for performance, and then we're working on a study that is investigating the French contrast method. So we're doing a first training study out of our lab that will actually start next week. So that's what we have going on right now.
All right, so getting geared up for that.
Yeah.
So were you able to find enough participants for what you needed? I mean, how many guys and gals are participating?
We're on the hunt right now, but we're shooting for 12 to 15 males with the hope of getting 10 to 12 to get them through the 6-week training. So it's hard to find qualified participants that are willing to give you 6 weeks of training and not do anything else on the side to ruin the study, and that they're qualified to be a part of the study, that they're familiar with the exercises and they have a base level of strength.
Right. So can you explain the difference between concentric, isometric, eccentric, and why are you looking at this accentuated eccentric training? Yeah,
so you hit on the 3 muscle actions. So you have the concentric action, which is considered the positive work. So as the muscle shortens, you raise the weight, and that's what we traditionally think of in training. We base most of our training prescription on the concentric load because you're trying to work within a certain repetition range or a percentage-based system, and that's all usually dictated on the concentric muscle action. And then you have an isometric action where your muscle is producing force, but there's no change in length. So people would do isometric mid-thigh pulls. Would be one version of an isometric test. Then the last muscle action would be the eccentric action, where you're actually producing force as the muscle lengthens. So you're forcibly lengthening. And the unique aspect about the eccentric muscle action is that you can actually handle more weight than the concentric action. And so our research is investigating if you overload that eccentric muscle action, will it provide additional training benefits? And there are several ways that you can overload it, but the way that we're currently using it in our lab and our research is with weight releasers, which make it a lot easier to load the motion because you load a heavier weight for the eccentric portion. But as you descend, if we're looking at a back squat, when you hit the bottom position of the squat, the weight releasers will fall off, leaving you with a lighter weight to stand up with on the concentric. So if you plan it correctly, you can add additional eccentric stress and potentially can improve performance by strengthening that portion of the muscle action. And that's what we're trying to investigate in the lab currently.
Gotcha. So with this eccentric training, I mean, is this something you would recommend for beginners, or is this more of an advanced, you have to have a couple of training years before you can implement this?
So there is some eccentric training that you can do with beginners, such as plyometric drops to hold, where you're preparing them and teaching them landing mechanics. That would be considered an eccentric overload, but one that a beginner or an intermediate athlete could use to gain control. but we would try and reserve, especially with weight releasers, the accentuated eccentric loading until someone has the requisite strength levels. So it hasn't truly been explored, but our current recommendations are submaximal AEL, so working at submaximal intensities of accentuated eccentric loading, so less than 100%. It's probably recommended to have a back squat around 1.5 to 2 times your body weight.
Okay.
And then when you start to explore maximal and supramaximal, which means you're going above 100% of your concentric max on the way down, and then a lower weight on the way up, we would recommend a back squat of around 2 times body weight as a general recommendation.
Gotcha.
So that would be someone considered, well-trained or base level of strong. And that will help to not only protect the athlete from getting injured because it's a pretty aggressive training method, but also that you drive the correct adaptations that you want, because it's quite stressful and you probably don't want to introduce it too early.
So stressful from, I don't know how I want to say this, but stressful from a neurological standpoint, or
neurological and from a muscular standpoint, because we know that heavy eccentric actions actually cause quite a bit of muscle soreness and muscle damage. Delayed onset muscle soreness pretty much always accompanies really heavy eccentrics, especially the first time that you do them. And it's also can be quite stimulatory on the nervous system, because if you are lifting a weight above your concentric max on the eccentric portion, that's going to be a fairly heavy weight for most people that they may be unaccustomed to lifting at that current time.
Okay. So with these weight releasers, are they doing singles and then racking the weight, or are they able to do this for multiple reps within a set?
So this is a great question, one that's not completely answered yet. We haven't done enough research with the hooks to know the best way to implement. But previous work done by Dr. John Waggle, who is with the Royals baseball organization now, he looked at 2 main ways to use them. One is using them only on the first rep. So if you're going to do a set of 5, you would eccentrically overload the first rep, and then reps 2 through 5 would be just straight sets to see if you can get a potentiation effect from that first repetition.
Gotcha.
And then the second way he looked at them was on every single repetition, having them put the bar into the rack, put the hooks back on, and then take it out again. So it essentially would be more of a cluster set, because you have to return the bar to the rack every time. Right. That's really the safest way to do it. But then the inter-repetition rest extends the length of the set.
Right.
And, training time is limited often. So that may not be the best way to go unless you have unlimited time to train for certain exercises.
Right. So another question I had was, as far as, planning, as far as the periodization model goes for this type of training, I mean, are you saying, okay, tempo is going to be 5 seconds the first week, 3 seconds the second week? I mean, is there anything like that you're assigning them?
So probably what we would incorporate is if we are trying to emphasize, let's say, lean body mass and hypertrophy early on in a plan, we might incorporate these accentuated eccentrics on more repetitions in a set.
Gotcha.
And that'll allow you to get a little bit of extra muscle damage, a little extra eccentric work performed, but still acquiring that large amount of volume that you need to maximize the hypertrophy during that period. Then maybe when we go to a strength block or a power block, we might begin incorporating them only on the first repetition to potentiate the set. So what John showed is that there's a unique stimulus probably from reps 1 to 3 after you use the hook. So you would do the first rep with the hooks, and then your next 2 reps would be just straight. And it seems that there's a positive effect from that first repetition. And we might use that to help enhance the bar velocity during a power phase when we're trying to move as quickly as we can.
Right.
That would provide a unique stimulus.
Okay. So now, like we were talking a few minutes ago, I mean, do you see this stuff on social media where people who don't know what they're doing or trying to just get likes or get views using these advanced techniques when they have no business using them? I mean, do you see stuff like this all the time?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of advanced methods that are used maybe at the wrong time or with the wrong population. So it definitely looks good online, so people pay attention to your content, which is great. You know, you have to keep people paying attention, but it may not always be in the best benefit for the athlete, because the first thing that can happen is that it's simply too stressful. So they're not going to recover correctly. They could get injured, which would be a horrible thing to occur.
Mm-hmm.
But the second consideration that you have to make is that anytime you introduce an advanced method to someone that's not prepared, you then lose the novel stimulus of that exercise that you might get later on. So if you already give it to them way too early, and then you try and use it again, it's not a new stimulus now for the body. And it may have been better if you just trained normally, got strong enough first, and then applied it later. You would get both the benefits of being able to recover and adapt from the stimulus and it being novel. So if you're doing all these advanced methods too early, you may make and remove that stimulus for them when they actually need it later.
Gotcha. Yeah, some of the things I've been seeing, like last week, I saw, number one, on back squat, someone wasn't even coming close to hitting depth. And they had chains on, and they were doing these for sets of 10. And I mean, just everything about the exercise they were doing was incorrect.
Yep.
And I think it just sets the athletes up for failure later, kind of what you already alluded to. So anyway, what are some other areas of research that you're doing right now?
So my master's student, he's a second-year student, he has brought forward an idea about running the French contrast method, which was popularized by Cal Dietz. He's been incorporating it with his athletes, but to date, I haven't found any actual training studies on incorporating the French contrast method into an athletic type performance. There are papers on it, but they were smaller one-off papers, and no one's actually done it for like a sports performance setting. So essentially what we've done is designed a 6-week study to kind of look like what a preseason workout would look like leading up to your season. And then we've incorporated in the French contrast method for that 6-week study. So we're combining together back squats, weighted trap bar jumps, body weight counter movement jumps, and then accelerated jumps, which is one of the things you'll see on social media where you hang the bands from the top of the rack.
Oh, yeah.
People hold on to them and then jump. So that's the fourth component to the plan that we have designed. And so we've designed it more as a strength and power block that would occur right before the season. And we're going to track our subjects for 6 weeks and look at the effect on maximal strength in the back squat and the trap bar deadlift, as well as their jumping abilities, which we'll collect on force plates.
Now, I might have missed it, but I mean, are there athletes that have agreed to do this in season or preseason?
These are all resistance trained males. So we're not able to alter the training plan for athletes right now.
Yeah.
We'd have to give it to everyone. So we've recruited males who have been resistance training and are familiar with the deadlift and the back squat. They need to have some requisite level of strength. We're shooting for around 1.5 to 2 times your body weight in the back squat. So we would call them moderately trained.
Gotcha. And, what are some other qualifiers for, moving a athlete from, beginner to intermediate to advanced? I mean, is it the back squat's the best assessment, or what do you look at?
Back squat's just one of many assessments that we look at with that athlete. Some people will never be able to squat 2 times their body weight because their sport doesn't demand it.
Mm-hmm.
But if they can do depth jumps and they can show that their reactive strength index is appropriate, for some upper body athletes, if they can handle a certain amount of bench press weight or if they can handle a certain amount of repetitions, it's kind of the coach's call. We just use that back squat as just a general recommendation from the literature. But there are certain athletes that you can tell are explosive, but you're not going to focus all your training time trying to get to that level. But if you can squat, 1.5 times your body weight, you're probably prepared for some entry-level advanced methods in training.
Right. Yeah, because that's another topic I keep hearing people discuss is, can you get too strong, or, how strong is too strong, or basically once you reach that 1.5, is time better spent on other techniques, So, I mean, any thoughts there? I mean,
So, yeah, I have heard the argument, like, can you get too strong? And the answer is probably not. But the amount of training input that you place into training to get those additional outcomes may not be worth it for certain sports.
Right.
So if you have to put in this many more hours of training or lifting or training volume just to get 10 or 15 more pounds on a lift, is that necessary? Probably not.
Yeah.
But in a context where you're trying to develop power in your athletes, it is always pertinent to get your athletes as strong as possible first and implement power training later. So there's some pretty good studies that have shown that if you try and do power training at the same time as strength training when you're relatively weak, it doesn't have as large of an effect as if you were to get strong first and add power training later.
Yep.
You acquire power more readily. So once you become to that, base level of strength, you should continue to try and get stronger within the time constraints and the program constraints that you have. But then you'll start to shift some of your training means more to power training, and you would just stick with strength training. And when you do that is really context specific for your sport. But I don't believe that you can ever become too strong.
Right.
I don't think that's a worry that anyone have. No one ever said, my athlete's just too strong. This is terrible. This is totally fine. But you just change the training means once they achieve that strength.
Yeah, I think that's something we see with our athletes for sure is, we're always emphasizing strength. Aside from proper movement patterns, good range of motion, strength is the next thing that we need to focus on.
Yeah.
So, so many times, since we deal with a lot of high school males, who are always in the weight room at school saying 1 rep max, 1 rep max, 1 rep max. It's like, you know what? You guys need to just trust the process that we're trying to take you through right now, and understand that it is not always about achieving a new 1 rep max. You need to move submaximal weights faster, or you need to increase your average working intensity. I mean, there's just so many ways to look at progress and success in the weight room aside from just 1 rep max strength.
Yeah, and that's only one form of strength that you possess as an athlete. Maximal strength is the one that most people talk about. That's only one of multiple types of strength that you can develop in the gym. And it's important to raise your maximal strength, but it's also important to alter all other areas of the force velocity curve at submaximal strength levels. So raising your speed strength, your strength speed, all of those characteristics are good too. So if you only train with one type of bar velocity all the time, that's the only place that you'll get stronger. And there's a time and place for that, but sport occurs on a spectrum of speeds and forces, and you need to be good at all of them to be good. So you can't just limit your training time to only one means.
Yeah, that's a great point for sure, because we've got, just as an example, we've got a volleyball athlete. She's, I think, heading into her senior season, but she totally got the concentric portion down. She's very springy, but then asking her to focus on basically the eccentric portion of every lift. I mean, she has a very difficult time doing that. So that's what we're focused on right now, is controlling her body weight through space. And then the springiness, I'm sure she'll retain all of that. But just getting her to understand this is an injury prevention. We're trying to make you more durable so that you can actually play your sport.
Yeah, and she's not likely to get injured taking off in a jump. She's more likely to get injured when she comes back down if she doesn't land correctly.
Exactly. And, it's just frustrating that, I don't know, there's people who are not nearly as qualified to be coaching in weight rooms. And as a result, we see things that are improperly placed at the wrong time before these athletes have hit any qualifiers, you know. So anyway, but yeah, so you said you're coaching Olympic weightlifting. You've got 2 clubs that you coach. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
So any techniques that you're kind of experimenting with in there with those athletes? Anything you're implementing?
I don't really experiment with the teams too much. My collegiate team at Sacred Heart are all beginner to intermediate athletes. So most of their training is just good, solid fundamentals.
Right.
We spend most of the time drilling the technique of the Olympic lifts in the beginning, and then we focus on developing their strength, because I've got some athletes that have never gone to the gym before. They show up on day one, and I have to teach them lifting from the ground up, which is great. No bad habits, but they're quite early in the developmental process. I have a few advanced athletes, but for now, we're just focusing on refining their technique and getting their strength levels to where they need to be, and trying to work on their weaknesses, because that's really what moves the total up in weightlifting competition, which is what we're concerned with when we compete. So each person will have a slightly different plan based on what they need to do, and no 2 athletes are ever exactly alike. So I use a lot of sound fundamentals, just really solid programming.
Yep.
You know, the Olympic lifts, their variations. We do pulls, squatting, pressing, and then in the very beginning, we just do more general physical prep with all the beginners. So some of them have never been in a weight room, but they're 18, 19, 20 years old. So I have to do all the work that they should have been doing when they were 12 to 15.
Right.
You know, weighted carries, sled drags, just endurance work. I even have some of them just do some light cardio on off days because they have no fitness base at all. Their oxidative capacity is so low, it actually limits their recovery. So I actually have them do a little bit of that in their plans early on, just so they can recover more quickly from their training.
Now, can you explain a little more in detail about what you mean by fitness base?
So a fitness base just means you are developing a wide array of general qualities such as coordination, balance, rhythm, timing, muscular endurance, strength, all of those capabilities that you build with general training needs. And if you get a hold of kids early enough when they're young, you can introduce a wide array of training means and skills like tumbling, rolling, jumping, gymnastics, swimming, track and field, and all of these just build general qualities. You're not really specializing in any of them, but you're providing them with a large range of motor skills that they can practice, learn, and then refine. And then through that time, you're slowly building up the work capacity of things that they're doing in the gym or through training. And this general work capacity allows you to later on specialize and capitalize on the work that you have developed. But if you're starting out later, you never develop those general qualities, and you may have a low fitness base. So with those older athletes, you need to establish some of those general skills that they need to be able to do, to have good body control and just general overall awareness of what they're doing in a training plan.
Right. And you already touched on it, that sports specialization. I mean, that's a battle that we are constantly trying to talk with parents and athletes and coaches. It's like, look, your kid is not going to get drafted at age 16. What they need is to play a multitude of sports, but for some reason, whoever's marketing this stuff is doing a phenomenal job. You have to specialize, and it's simply not true. I love the answer you just gave. That if people aren't encouraging their children to do a wide variety of things for the reasons you just listed, I don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
So, but if
you're working with kids and you get them young enough, kids 5 and 6 can begin doing physical activity, even younger than that, really.
That's right.
Little kids play all the time.
Yep.
But you want to expose your kid to as many different types of motor skills that they can when they're young.
Yep.
This means anything. It's like obstacle courses, rock climbing, any of those sports, swimming, gymnastics, any motor skill that they can try and develop and refine early on will pay off later when they do choose to specialize. Yeah. You do a lot of general training from ages 5 to 16, and then maybe in their junior or senior year, you begin to specialize to the sport that best suits them. But until then, you're doing a huge disservice if you don't allow them to play as many different types of sports as they can, but also building in some rest by switching sports,
right?
In and out of seasons to provide some different stimuli. And there's very few sports that benefit from early specialization. There are certain sports where that's demanded by the sport.
Sure.
But you'll know if that sport requires it or not, because you'll know that most people are done competing by the time all the other kids are starting to go off to college. Things like, gymnastics is probably the one example where you would specialize early. But that's pretty much the notable exception. All other sports are really going to be a long-term development process that begins when you're a kid, and then you slowly refine down to the best sport for you when you're between the ages of 15 to 19, depending on the sport.
Right.
You know where you'll end up growing into, like body size, proportion, and you may not know what your genetic profile is setting you up for. So you could pick the wrong sport, and if you specialize, you might miss out on what you're really good at if you choose the wrong sport.
That's a good point. Now, one question I had for you, I talked to Tim the other day about it as well, but I'm just curious if you do anything different. When it comes to managing fatigue with athletes, and this is where he introduced me to the RSI. I hadn't heard of that, and talked about weekly testing of the RSI and basically how you're going to look at athletes. But what do you do from managing fatigue standpoint?
So right now we work with men's and women's basketball here at Sacred Heart, and our department helps to do weekly jumps with them to monitor their fatigue levels. So we just use a counter movement jump. And so Tim may have been using depth jumps and got a true RSI score. And then based on their current trend line, if you notice that many of your data points are starting to fall below what you want, you would maybe alter the training plan due to fatigue. We use RSI modified and then flight time over contact time. Okay. And that kind of tells us how you're jumping as opposed to how high. Because at a certain point, the jump height may remain unaltered. It just depends on the strategy that you use to jump to achieve that jump height. Right. So if you're spending a lot of time on the ground and you're using a lot of force to achieve that jump height, that's one way to do it. Or you could use a more velocity component where you're coming off the force plates quicker and achieving the same jump height. And that's something that we look at with that flight time over contraction time on the plates.
Gotcha.
So we don't do depth jumps right now. We've just been using counter movement jumps. We have some younger athletes on the teams. And so most people know how to do a counter movement jump fairly easy. Whereas depth jumps, some people may not have incorporated them into the training plan yet. And even though you're going from a small box, you don't want it to be like a new stimulus, because it might just get better because they learned how to jump better. Right. You may not be looking at fatigue. So we just use counter movement jumps now. But if we start extending to other sports, we may use a depth jump. So we may work with the volleyball teams at some point, and that might be something we would use with them, is like a small height depth jump, and then look at the true RSI score to get a handle on fatigue.
Gotcha. Now, is there anything I'm seeing GPS is becoming more and more popular.
Correct.
Have you messed with any of that when it comes to basketball?
We have not used GPS with basketball, but we have a Polar team unit. We've put it on some of the football players and then the soccer players here. So GPS is a great tool if you can incorporate it seamlessly and you have somebody that can run all the data. It's a part-time to full-time job to run all that data. So with all my demands, it's not something that I can do by myself. I'd have to have a team of people to help me.
Mm-hmm.
At ETSU, I saw some of the data returns that the guys working with men's and women's soccer would do, and it was a time-intensive process that they would have to run. So definitely good data that you can get, as long as you know within that data what you want to use, because you can be quickly overwhelmed with hundreds of data points. You probably just want to refine it down to a certain amount of metrics that you can actually track, like distance covered, time spent in different speed zones, and then maybe some heart rate measures to get an internal and external training load would be good from GPS. But I'm probably not the expert on the data that you can gather, just because I haven't had enough time to actually do it.
Yeah, I've basically heard other coaches say the same thing, is they more or less have to hire either a full-time assistant who that is their job, or like Tim was telling me, he said, I think I'm going to have a grad student that's going to be their project, is managing the data and then relaying that information on to Tim. So I don't have enough time to get into that world. It's definitely beneficial. It's just I don't have enough time to try and master those skills at this point. And kind of going back to the sports specialization for a moment, I think more teams, especially from a professional level, are using more data points and more evaluation tools to look at, if we're going to invest millions of dollars in this athlete, let's look at everything possible. But I think sometimes, number one, it's a crapshoot, because you look at a guy as complete opposite, Tom Brady, who's drafted 6th round. I mean, who knew that he was going to be one of the best quarterbacks of all time?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say best, because, I'm a Colts fan by heart, so I can't say. But, who knew he was going to be the best drafted in the 6th round? No idea. But then on the flip side, some of this data that's getting relayed, people don't know what to do with it. It's like, cool, we've got this data, but now what happens?
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen the same thing with velocity-based training. That's becoming more popular. And if you don't have, a Tendo unit or something to measure that bar speed, now we're relying on coaches' eyes, and that being such a subjective measure. But basically, it goes back to that sequencing that we talked about earlier, is people are putting the velocity base first before they've established a good GPP base before they should be using that. But is there anything else that you've seen as far as new tools that are coming along, or new data points that people are evaluating that's just a waste of time?
I don't know about a waste of time, because definitely any tool that you can find, you can incorporate it, as long as you know the data that's going to come out of the device that you're using and the context that you're using it in. I think many different tools could be useful. And as a coach, you can always try and pull new ideas and devices from other fields and incorporate them into training that might give you an advantage. But when you pull a new device in to use it, you want to first know, is it valid? Is it going to measure what you actually want it to measure? And the second and the most important thing is the device reliable within the day and between days? Because if it's not been validated and the reliability has not been established, you can't determine any training outcomes from it, due to the fact that it could be giving you incorrect data. So it's cool to incorporate new tools and ideas, but you need to have those baseline measurements made first before you can base training decisions, because if it's not reliable, you could get widely different results on different days and then make a wrong training decision, and that might negatively affect your athlete. So definitely be open-minded to incorporate new items, but definitely know that some of them have drawbacks, and you want to consider, if no one has done any of those studies, maybe you can be the first one to do it, and see if it actually works. But take some of that data that's coming out of the devices with a grain of salt, especially if the results are widely different between days.
You were just telling me a minute ago about some projects that you have coming up for the fall semester. So you're talking about body tempering. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So Donnie Thompson, who was a world champion powerlifter, came up with a method that's essentially a more aggressive form of foam rolling by using heavy weighted implements to try and restore muscle function, increase flexibility and mobility, and help to alleviate some of the soreness that you get with training. Right. Another person that's incorporated this and is a big proponent of it is Chris Duffin from Kabuki Strength out in Oregon. And so to date, only one study, I think it just came out yesterday, investigated body tempering as it relates to performance. I haven't even had a chance to read the paper yet, but we're going to design a study here investigating body tempering and its effects on strength and power. So we'll look at jumping, an isometric mid-thigh pull, and we'll also look at range of motion changes, and we're going to try and compare the foam rolling to body tempering and to investigate if there is a performance enhancement, but also we'd want to investigate if there's any performance reduction. So we know if you static stretch before you do power training, there's a reduction that occurs, but no one's investigated the body tempering. I would suspect that there is no negative on power output based on the protocol, but we simply don't know because no one's done it yet. So we're going to be pilot testing in the fall to get prepared for that in the spring, and then we'll probably do a controlled study in the springtime to investigate those devices and find the best way to implement them before training or with your athletes.
Gotcha. Now, I think it's a couple of years ago, I remember a coach was trying to argue, and I don't know if he had anything to support this theory or not, but he was basically arguing that foam rolling had a negative effect on Golgi tendon organs. So for that reason, he was saying how he is not an advocate of, now granted, his position could have changed completely, but initially, I mean, have you seen or heard anything about negative effects from foam rolling or negative effects from basically any type of recovery modalities like that?
So the effects from foam rolling are neutral to positive, I would say. Not really detrimental effects to foam rolling. I think there were some worries in the beginning. There's still not a lot of great studies on the mechanisms behind foam rolling or why it works. And I suppose maybe there could be a way that it would affect the Golgi tendon organ, but I can't imagine that it would affect it in a negative way. Right. Because the Golgi tendon organ is a protective mechanism built into the tendon to activate when it suspects that too much force is present and you're more likely to get injured, and it shuts off the stimulus to the muscle. So if you're foam rolling and then your Golgi tendon organ actually maybe became desensitized to the foam rolling, I'm just speculating here because I don't know if this has actually been measured, that might be a beneficial adaptation for some populations, because a lot of neural training later on is becoming comfortable with really heavy weights. So the Golgi tendon organ doesn't activate. So if you could make it less active, that would be a net positive for certain activities. Maybe not in beginner populations where they might exceed what they can do. Sure. But if you could actually cause that to fire less, there may be some sports where that might be a good thing to do for them. Right. But again, I don't know if those mechanisms have been explored by foam rolling. Most of the studies I've looked at are just, did foam rolling reduce force production? And the answer was no. Did it increase range of motion? Sometimes. Does it help with delayed onset muscle soreness? I think it's equivocal. Might help sometimes, may not. But as far as I've seen, there's not been a negative to foam rolling. Right.
And it kind of goes back to, I remember when I was at Ball State, the biomechanics lab was finished with those vibrating plate, and brought that down. And the strength coach was like, man, I have no use for this. But for some reason, athletes loved it. So, it was the whole placebo effect. I mean, 100% was, you know what? Use it. Who cares? If you think it works and it feels good and it feels like it preps you for a training session, fine.
Yeah. So what they call that, the nocebo effect.
Nocebo effect.
I think it does. Yeah, they basically don't do anything that the literature has shown. But hey, if it makes you feel good, go ahead and do it.
Yeah, right.
As long as there's no negative, go ahead.
Yeah. And we were talking a few minutes ago about, some of the things that athletes will see on social media, and one that gets a lot of attention is, West Side Method, where it's, 2 max out days a week, 2 speed training days a week.
Yep.
1 upper, 1 lower of each. So I think a lot of our young kids especially see these guys who are well prepared, seasoned lifters.
Oh yeah.
Who should be maxing out since that's their specific sport. But, what's the likelihood of being able to, for a high school kid, being able to max out multiple times in a week and recover and play their sport? I mean,
yeah. Those advanced methods and watching those lifters train at Westside Barbell and around the world with these weights on a routine basis is amazing.
Yeah.
But those methods are probably best reserved for those lifters at that point in time.
Right.
But if people really wanted to know how those people started, they want to ask them what they were doing 15, 20 years ago when they first started training. Because most of the intro kids are seeing end stage athletes near the prime of their career and then trying to emulate that training now, way before they're prepared for that type of training. So the best question that you could ask these people when they achieve these high results, what did you do when you started? And what was your training like when you were my age? And they're probably going to give a quite different answer than what they're currently doing now in these high maxed out stages. And so when you're doing these max out multiple times per week, you're developing strength and you're also expressing it in these categories. But younger athletes need to spend more time developing strength in general qualities that they can build upon later to handle that maxing out at a later time. So most likely, maxing out multiple times per week may work in the short term, but may not carry over for a long period of time in their development. So they would be better served to train with submaximal weights, working on moving them as quickly as possible with excellent technique, and then having planned times where you test, repetition maximums that are well within their capabilities, so that, number one, you stay injury free and you have those methods for later when you need them to drive adaptations. You're going to get stronger from sets of 10, 12, even 15 when you're really young. Why not take advantage of that then, and then save those other weights for later when you need them to really drive those adaptations? It'll make you more resilient when you're younger. You're less likely to get injured because you're working within a lighter weight that you can handle with good technique. And then you're preparing yourself to do those things later where you'll actually lift more weight when you're more developed. So really cool to see, but may not always be appropriate for the developing athlete. So
yeah, those younger kids definitely don't. It's hard to get them to understand the macro standpoint of you have to be patient. And I know the training is not that exciting right now. It's the same thing over time is what's going to drive results. But, so thanks for speaking to that. I appreciate it. So let's see. The only other thing I wanted to discuss was, is there anything you're seeing, or maybe you had hands-on experience with in the strength and conditioning world that, just needs to fall by the wayside? Old methods, principles you disagree with that you think people need to understand are not effective?
I don't know if there's any method that exists that needs to be getting rid of. I think everything needs to be context specific. So anything that you can do, any exercise, can have a place in a training plan, but you may not use it all the time or with every athlete. Maybe the thing that some people do is trying to take all the things that they see and combine all those aspects into one training plan all at the same time. So I think maybe that would be one thing I would like to see change is you see a new item on the internet and you incorporate it into your training plan. You do that over and over. And now you have 7 things in your training plan that may or may not be beneficial. It might be better spread those 70 training items over a longer term period, because some of them probably work just later, and then some of them are going to be better now. So if you're combining, breathing techniques with, all these different types of lifting methods, and then you're doing cool down exercises, and in the end, your program, it's like a Frankenstein program. Put all this stuff together at once. It would be better to master the fundamentals first and slowly incorporate new methods as you see the need, than try and throw everything at the wall all at once and see what sticks.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's anything necessarily that I would say is bad, because I don't think we can always say in every context that something doesn't work.
Right.
But I think as long as you have sound fundamentals and you follow training principles, you have a training philosophy and you stick to it, over time you can slowly evolve and begin to add new things as you see them and as your experience lets you know that they work, and then develop that way instead of always trying to incorporate new things into a plan.
All right. Well, now, are you on social media at all? Would you like people to have your social media or email or anything like that if we have questions about anything?
Yeah, they can always send me an email. I pretty much always respond, and it's just my Sacred Heart email. Probably link it up when you post the show. And then I'm on Instagram, Tabor 85 kg. That was my old weightlifting weight class before they had to change all of them. So
are you up to the 94 or are you 89 now?
I'm at 89. Okay. So
yeah. Oh wait, they moved the 90, didn't they?
Yeah, 90 is now 96.
So you don't want to go to 96 yet?
No, I'm staying at 89. So it's 81, 89, 96 now.
Okay.
So
yeah,
gotta get people to stop taking drugs so they stop changing the weight class.
You think they're taking drugs? What?
No, definitely not.
No, this is all natural.
You can find me on Twitter there. I always post up stuff that our lab is doing and collaborations I do with other colleagues. So I'm trying to stay on there and keep it up to date.
Now, do you have a ResearchGate page as well?
Yep, I'm on there as well.
Perfect. I'll put that in there. Yeah, man, that ResearchGate stuff is awesome.
Yeah, it's really good.
So, all right. Well, thank you very much for being on. I really appreciate your time.